Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. Please consider becoming a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can listen to Labyrinths ad-free.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson to learn more.
In the crook of the tree, he said, "Here's your plant." I looked at it. I instantly recognized it. That was Codenanthopsis dissimulata. I said, "How did you find it?" He said that the night before he had taken Kamarampi, and during the time he had a vision, a woman came to him and said, "This is the plant you're looking for."
Feeling lost?
Then you're in the right place.
I'm Amanda Knox.
And I'm Christopher Robinson.
And this is Labyrinths.
Dr. Ethan Russo is a neurologist and psychopharmacology researcher who has served as the director, president, or chairman of several international research organizations, and who has published over 50 articles with 8,500 citations on topics relating to neurology, pain management, and ethnobotany. He has worked for biotechnology companies, developing treatments for cancer pain and intractable epilepsy, and he's held faculty appointments and visiting professorships at various universities, including the University of Washington, University of Montana, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins. Given all that, what's surprising is his area of expertise and how he wound up there through a transformative visit to the Peruvian rainforest.
I'm a neurologist by training, but actually for 50 years I've studied psychedelics and cannabis, certainly intensively the last 28 years. Basically, that became my second career, or third, depending on how you want to count.
That's a big flip from traditional medicine. What led you into studying medicine and specifically the brain?
Well, I was always interested in psychopharmacology, basically the study of how drugs affect the brain. So I was in high school. I was really interested in psychiatry and thought that's where I'd end up. But I was really taken in college with a physiological psychology course, which was more comparative psychology, that really explained how neurological mechanisms and behavior work together. And I realized that I was really more interested in neurology. So at the ripe age of 19, I decided to be a neurologist.
Why psychology? What about human behavior was so interesting to you from a medical standpoint?
I really had to do with drugs.
Okay. Were you a drug user as a teenager?
No, I really wasn't. I was probably the last in my peer group to try cannabis, but I was 18, so this was 1970. We had a graduation party on Nantucket. I won't use names. One other fellow and I were the only ones in our peer group that didn't partake of the Moroccan keef that was on offer, and I really began to think about it. I went home, and my older brother had just arrived from his first year at veterinary school, and I asked him about cannabis, and he just said, "You have to try it." But instantly, he went off to Stanford to summer school, and when he came back, he had 2 ounces of genuine Acapulco Gold, which I really think doesn't exist anymore. This was special. I'm not sure I've ever told this story on air, but my parents have passed away, so I can.
You're not going to get in trouble.
Not from them, but they went out for the evening. Mm-hmm. So we went up in the spare room in our house, which was built in 1824. This is in Massachusetts, so a big old house. We were well into the second joint of this Acapulco Gold. My brother was quite ultra galactic by that point, but I wasn't feeling anything.
Okay.
So he had me hyperventilate, which is a technique that sometimes will, quote, get people off, unquote, when they're not feeling anything. And when I came out of it, the wall density was changing. And
wait, what does that mean?
I could sense the density of the wall.
It was just a feeling.
Gravity.
Okay.
And it was undulating as well. And you know, I uttered the immortal words, "Oh, wow," and my life was never the same afterwards. So sort of archetypally, we listened to Surrealistic Pillow by Jefferson Airplane. We ate a bunch of food, and that was it. And I was a convert to cannabis. Although there is no evidence for the gateway theory, it was not long before I was trying other drugs. And it was a voyage of exploration. Certainly I enjoyed it, but I was trying to find greater truths of consciousness. That doesn't sound too pedantic.
And how does that relate to brain development and pediatric neurology?
That came later. My first experience in pediatric neurology was at State Hospital in Massachusetts. In those days, there were still children who were, the unkind word would be warehoused. These were kids with extreme neurologic difficulties whose parents, quite rightly, were unable to care for them. And they were resident at this hospital. I saw things there that I've never seen since. Very rare diseases.
Neurological diseases.
Exactly.
Can you give some examples?
Hydrocephalus, so water on the brain, but we're talking about heads the size of watermelons.
Oh, no.
No, it's really tragic. Things like Friedreich's ataxia, degenerative disease of the cerebellum that affects coordination and just about everything else. At the time, because of the intellectual interest I developed, I could put aside the emotional component to some extent. But over time, I found that much more difficult.
Totally.
Ultimately, after medical school, 5 years of residency training, and 20 years in practice, I decided emotionally I really wasn't cut out for that job.
So what did you do?
Well, it was an evolution. Before that, in 1990, I'd been in practice for 7 years in Missoula, Montana. And I was really frustrated in that I wasn't curing much of anything. And I wasn't necessarily helping people as much, anywhere near what I wanted. And I recognized the shortcomings of conventional medicine.
How did you see those shortcomings?
It was a revolving door. Mrs. Jones would have migraines, and every month she'd come in for a new drug for us to try. Same thing with seizure disorders. And gradually I was giving people increasingly toxic drugs with less and less benefit. And I realized that there had to be a better way, or certainly I wasn't going to be able to continue. So it really turned my focus back to medicinal plants, something I'd been interested in as a teenager. I think there are probably very few people in the audience that recognize the name I'm about to use, but Yule Gibbons, he was a pitch man for grape nuts. He said that the taste reminded him of wild hickory nuts. He said in a very folky voice. But he had written books about foraging and particularly the healthful herbs. And I'd been fascinated with this book, but really hadn't applied it in some time. But I wanted to incorporate herbal treatments into my practice. I had a research interest in migraine, and I investigated where in the world did indigenous people know the most about treating migraine with plants. And like so many things, it was the Amazonian rainforest.
They have a lot of plants there.
Yeah, rather. I took Spanish classes at night once a week for a year and a half while I was intensively studying. I became the best friend of the interlibrary loan at the University of Montana. I would spend hours photocopying journal articles from the library. But all this culminated in 1994, going to the Peruvian rainforest for the first time.
We could give you lots of reasons to support Labyrinths on Patreon, including ad-free episodes and exclusive patron-only content. But why not hear it direct from a listener?
My name is Henry, and I've been a supporter of the Labyrinths podcast for some time. I can totally relate to the concept of feeling lost, and I think the stories have helped me tremendously getting through these last couple of years, and I think they would help others as well.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson.
It was a program called Pharmacy from the Rainforest. Basically, I met some of the real luminaries of the ethnobotanical field, so people who studied medicinal plants from indigenous people. But that was a taste. The next year, I hooked up with Glenn Shepard, who was at that time a grad student who was working with the Machigenga or Matsigenka tribe in a different part of Peru in the southeast in Parque Nacional del Manu. And we spent about 2.5 months collecting medicinal plants, in this instance about 500, that they used for specific medical purposes.
I'd love to know what that looks like. Like, are you just camping out with the tribe? Like, are you
Basically,
wearing a loincloth? Like, what's going on here?
I could have used the loincloth, but no, I had long sleeve pants and shirt from Patagonia, thank you. Yeah, it was quite a thing. Basically, flying in a small plane out of Cusco down to a jungle airstrip where the trees were no more than a couple of meters beyond the wingtips, waiting a few hours for a boat to arrive, and then spending 3 days going down the Madre de Dios and then at the Manu River and the Quebrada Yumribato, sometimes having to push the small boat over snags of fallen trees to get to the village where these people lived.
Was any part of you nervous about being that far away from, quote, civilization?
I was too excited to be nervous.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. How old were you?
So I would have been 43, I guess. At that time, Parque Nacional was sort of concentric circles around a core. The outer circle, people could visit if they could get there. The next circle in, you needed special government permission to get into, and we were in the core, which you could only go into with a government-approved research program or being an indigenous person yourself. We're talking really remote. In fact, before I came, an uncontacted group of Machigengo who spoke the same language, but people who had never seen Westerners before. Some of them had joined their group. For instance, a young man that was basically looking for a wife. So, I mean, he was like all of 17, but this is the way it was done there. Before people get funny ideas, I should say that marriages among the Machigengo were probably about the most stable I've ever encountered. And they also had the most placid children I've ever seen anywhere in the world.
Okay, I want to hear more about that as a parent.
Sure. Well, they had a series of plants that were named the plant of the spider monkey or the plant of the squirrel monkey. And they bathed their children in these. Instead of the children flailing and complaining, they were very happy and remained very happy. And I was really struck by this. So their explanation of how this worked was that they bathed the children with these plants to prevent them being affected by an evil spirit of the animal that had been hunted. To me, it was quite different. Subsequently, some of these we investigated for serotonin receptor activity. In other words, drugs that would affect anxiety, depression, these kinds of things. And we had about a 95% hit rate.
Wow.
That's the good news scientifically. The bad news is we never had the money to investigate further.
Come on. I feel like this is $1 million idea.
Well, could be.
Okay, the plant of the spider monkey is what I need to get my hands on. Okay, all right. Tell me about that experience. How does that compare to medical school?
Same thing, but very different.
Okay.
I brought some medicine with me and had to do some very hairy things, things that I had never done or hadn't done in years.
Like what?
Lancing an abscess, things like that without getting too gory. Treating a child for seizures related to Shigella and infectious gastroenteritis, but with no equipment to speak of these kinds of things. But for the Machigenga, their medicine comes from the forest. So people have to understand this is an environment where the normal Westerner wouldn't last 2 days. A hostile, totally unfamiliar environment. unless you know that if a monkey eats something, you can eat it. Basically, whatever ails you is treated with an herb from the rainforest. And how they find these things out is really a fascinating aspect of it. Some of it is just oral tradition passed on from one generation to another. But that's not all. When they run into something sticky, something that isn't working, or a problem that remains recalcitrant, they resort to divination. And this is mediated by plants. And the most common would be with what people commonly know as ayahuasca, the vine of the soul. They called kamarampi. So what this is a plant called Banisteriopsis caapi. And it's a very undulating vine. It's very strange. It has 3 filaments that wind around each other. This contains what are called harmine and harmaline. These are alkaloids related to atropine. By themselves, they would maybe produce a little sedation, but that's actually not the key part that is psychedelic. That comes from another plant that they called urubambashi, which is a Psychotria viridis, most closely related to a coffee plant. So leaves of this are combined with the vine, which is beaten and then boiled for a bunch of hours. And then communally, they drink this and go on a trip, basically.
The whole tribe together.
It could be any number of people, including women and even children as young as 9, which will freak a lot of people out. However, there are no known physiological harms to this. You can scare yourself amazingly because it's an extremely intense psychedelic experience. For the Machigenga, unlike some tribes where they drink once and it might last a couple of hours, they drink all night. But why do they do this? Well, part of it is an adaptation to trying to live in a hostile environment. And that means a number of things. It means we're hungry and we need kamarampi to help us know where to hunt or where to fish. Or, importantly, what medicine does my wife need to help with her abdominal pain? And that may point them to something that's a known entity, but more often than not, it will lead them to a plant they haven't used before.
Interesting.
And this is where people need to suspend disbelief because this really happens. And they have an innate sense of things. We could show you 2 plants that even to a botanist would look identical, that they would find distinctly different with different names and different purposes. Just in the time we were there, we documented use of somewhere between 7 and 10 different Psychotria species that they used for different purposes. So the urubambashi was used for the kamarampi mixture, for the ritual drinking. Related species, another Psychotria, wasn't used for that at all. That use was fascinating and was really getting to the heart of why I was there. 2 distinct things. They would take leaves of this, they would mash them up, wrap it in banana leaf with filter made from native cotton, and drip it in the eye. And that was for 2 purposes. One was to increase their sensory acuity for hunting, and the other was to treat migraine headaches. So I had occasion to see this done and use it myself several times.
Did they do that for you? Like you just laid down and...
It's the best thing I've ever used because in 15 minutes, headache would be gone, nausea if there, sensitivity of the eyes to light, any of the symptoms were gone. And what you were left with was things are brighter and sharper and maybe I can hear better. And that relates to this heightening of the senses that they use to improve their hunting prowess. So basically what we were dealing with was the theory I developed before this, others had known, which was that many drugs that are hallucinogenic or psychedelic at high doses treat headaches at low doses. So there are many examples. The most frequently cited one or understood one would be the ergot alkaloids. These are chemicals that come from a fungus on rye, and a whole series of drugs were developed by Sandoz, the Swiss chemical company, by Albert Hofmann. One of these was a slightly altered molecule that became known as lysergic acid diethylamide.
LSD.
Right. But I had known that there were many related drugs that could do the same thing if you took enough, but at a low dose, they would treat migraine headaches.
How long have we known about this?
Since his work, basically in the 40s, 50s. But people have to bear in mind, there was a tremendous amount of work done on LSD for medical use and psilocybin and some with mescaline in the 1950s. And some really important things were found. But this all went underground for years because of prohibition.
So you lived through trying to bring this back into the light and of the medical field. What did that look like?
Well, after my time with the Machigenga, Glenn had told me that when you get back, you need to contact Rick Doblin at MAPS. So that's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Rick, for decades now, has been trying to get MDMA, ecstasy, approved as a mainstream drug, which we hope will happen later this year for treatment of post-traumatic stress. But I got in contact with Rick. We hit it off very well. I wrote a piece for their journal, basically called the Schedule 1 Project, which had to do with forbidden drugs like LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and using them to treat headaches.
And what was the thesis statement? Just, we should be using them?
Yes. Again, historically, going back to the ergots, working on these observations of the psychotria leaf juice in the eye treating migraine, I knew it was better than what conventional medicine was offering. Then things took a tangent. By then, it was 1996. Prop 215 in California had come along, and medical cannabis was about to be legalized in one state for the first time. I was sort of pressed into service, along with Donald Abrams, who was looking at cannabis to treat symptoms of AIDS. At that time, he thought I should also try to look at cannabis for migraine, which, again, I knew should work. Then things got really difficult because I was going headlong against government policy. We're trying to do this by the book, with FDA-approved studies, but the National Institute on Drug Abuse had a monopoly on the supply of cannabis. So to get any to do a study that would be legal, I had to go through them. And to make a long story short, I got stonewalled for 3 years.
What did that look like? Just writing application after application after application?
Exactly.
And nothing.
No, always a denial.
Always a denial.
For whatever generally arbitrary reason.
Did it ever occur to you to knock on someone's door and just be shake them a little, or what? How?
Well, that would be assault.
Okay, so all you could do was just apply and hope, and nothing happened.
Yeah, but I didn't go into the study of cannabis or these other drugs to become an activist, but the government turned me into one. About that time, I was studying intensively cannabis, its history in medicine, as well as the endocannabinoid system. So I'd learned all this stuff. My first journal article about cannabis was in 1998. It got the notice of Jeffrey Guy, a physician in the UK, who had just gotten permission from the British Home Office to develop cannabis as a pharmaceutical. He asked me to be on his board. Subsequently, I did consulting work for GW Pharmaceuticals for 5 years until they asked me to come on full-time in 2003. And so I was senior medical advisor with them for 11 years. And from that, 2 pharmaceuticals were developed. One called Sativex is a spray in the mouth combining THC and CBD that was approved in 30 countries for treatment of spasticity, muscle tightness, and multiple sclerosis. Unfortunately, it was not approved in the U.S. yet.
Why?
We were studying it for cancer pain. Bottom line, it worked in American patients, the American subspecies, I like to say. It didn't work in the very, very ill, near-death Eastern European patients. So during this time, I mean, it was comical in a way. We would be seeing doctors in Romania coming into the hospital, and there'd be 15 people, patients with their families under a single naked light bulb, not having enough chairs. And we'd go in and see the doctor, and hopefully it's different now, but in Eastern Europe at the time, to get morphine or opioids to treat your cancer pain, you had to be extremely sick. There was very little supply. If you failed that and qualified to get Sativex to treat your cancer pain, you were near death. So there was this dichotomy. The American patients weren't as sick. When you're near death, often nothing works. So that's the reason that we don't have Sativex. The other drug is approved by the Food and Drug Administration called Epidiolex, and it basically is almost pure cannabidiol, CBD, for treatment of intractable epileptic syndromes. So I was involved in the development program of both of those drugs. And in 2020, I began my own company with Nishal Whiteley called Credo Science. And basically our working motto is making cannabis safer and better. But we're also still trying to do psychedelic work.
So this has been an interesting, long career and personal journey for you. Have you ever felt lost? Did you ever feel like, what am I doing?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll go back to something you sort of asked before. It had to do with reaction of my peers in the medical community. Yeah, my peers, this is in Montana, most of the guys there, the doctors, went there because they hunt or fish or both. Yeah, they thought I was nuts. But when they began to see the kind of results that we were getting, either because they found out that, geez, Mrs. Jones is using cannabis and she's better than, she's ever been under my care, or, gee, she seems to like the St. John's wort more than the Prozac. Gradually, they understood and even sent patients to me, but I've always been the proverbial salmon upstream against the current and the dams. That's been the story of my life, so.
Have you ever just wanted to, turn direction and just take it easy?
Yeah, it didn't work for me.
No. All right.
I've never been mainstream.
You've seen all of the resistance there has been to cannabis being accepted as having any kind of medical merit and medical value. What was your experience seeing the sudden shift of everyone having sudden access to cannabis and now the commercialization of cannabis for its recreational use as opposed to its medical use?
Complex question, but we need to keep in mind, we in Washington state have the luxury of having access to cannabis medicinally for some 20 years.
Yeah.
And legally for, about 10. That isn't true everywhere. We're next door to Idaho, which is about the most prohibitionist state there is. And there's still tremendous resistance to the apparent intent to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1, which is for addictive, dangerous drugs with no recognized medical use, to Schedule 3. But we're not there yet, is the bottom line. And I'm not a complacent individual. If I have success, my usual attitude towards it is, that's nice. What do we need to do next? things can go backwards. We shouldn't forget that. Again, because I'm old, I remember in the 70s, we were very close to cannabis decriminalization. But a variety of things happened, culminating in Reagan becoming president. And everybody knows Nancy Reagan, just say no. And basically research and access was set back at least 20 years.
Wild.
And that can happen again.
I mean, I'm sure you've been following the legalization of psychedelics in Oregon. Your take? How's it going?
It's supposed to be done, people are supposed to get psilocybin, for example, in the context of counseling sessions. And I think it costs about $6,000.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that expensive.
So there's an access problem. Again, there's a difference between that, which can be extremely helpful. It really depends on the training and experience of the clinician as to how that's going to turn out. I think people are generally aware that these are very powerful tools and things can go wrong. People can get panicked and, a common feeling sometime during the experience is, will I ever come out of this? That's always the issue. We can reassure people that these drugs don't have a lot of innate toxicity. They do not cause brain damage. They do not cause chromosome breakage. But yes, they can psychologically wound someone if the situation isn't right. So particularly, let's just take a kid who decides they want to do acid and they're in an urban environment, maybe violent, and suddenly they're confronted with the reality of their life in a state of mind that they can't control at all. It's like the proverbial roller coaster that you can't get off. It's frightening. So it has to be handled properly. Never alone. Hopefully, when you're in a serene state, in a serene environment, and you have to have a guide, a trusted individual who is not partaking of the same drug and can deal with external factors that may be intrusive. I, as you can tell, have great respect for the power of these drugs. Like anything, can be used for good or bad.
So how are you and your company in particular attempting to adopt psychedelics and make them safe? Would you use them primarily for medicinal purposes, or would you also advocate for recreational purposes?
I'm not against recreational use, but again, it has to be done properly.
Okay.
So again, we're all about safety. To answer the question, for example, we're trying to work with a company now that's interested in the San Pedro cactus. San Pedro is a columnar cactus. People are probably more familiar with peyote. Like peyote, the San Pedro cactus contains mescaline. Unlike peyote, which is an endangered species, the Trichocereus or Echinopsis is very easy to grow and isn't endangered. This company we're interested in working with because they seem to have great respect for the indigenous traditions of the people in the high Andes that grow this and use it again for healing and divination. We're interested in using this as a treatment for alcoholism, which is very much in keeping with what the Native American Church, how they use peyote. For people who aren't aware, the Native American Church is what's called as a syncretic religion. It combines elements of Christianity, but with a sacrament of peyote. One of the problems that they're addressing is rampant alcoholism among Native Americans. And it certainly has been demonstrated that people who use this either stop drinking or drink much less problematically. So we'd like to try the same thing, but not in a ritual context, but rather with a medicine that could be FDA approved.
What do you make of the ritual context? You mentioned when using, psilocybin, for example, you'd want a guide who's not partaking. But back in the rainforest, everyone was having a sip of ye old potion.
More than a sip.
More than a sip. Everyone was guzzling the potion.
Yeah.
So
in between episodes of vomiting. Yeah, I'm glad you brought us back to that because I wanted to explain what they do. They drank they chant. They had sort of a mouth violin called the pergampi, and they're chanting, they're asking Kamarampi for help again to find what they need, whether it be medicine or success in finding food. Also, there's a good bit of telepathy going on. People might verbally or telepathically be communicating with other people and saying, this is what Kamarampi has taught me. I will tell you now so that you too may live. So it's a very profound thing. Now, I mentioned telepathy. How do I know that this happens? One of our guides was named Mateo. For weeks and weeks and weeks, we were looking for a particular plant I had my eyes on called Codonanthopsis dissimulata, which is a Gesneriad, a member of the African violet family. And I wanted this because not in Peru, but in Ecuador, Native Americans there drip this in the nose to treat migraine. And that was really suggestive because if you're having a migraine and vomiting, you can't always take something by mouth.
Right.
So this suggested that there was something that worked there. Well, we didn't find this, but I'd been ahead on the trail. Mateo called to me and said, we found your plant. And I followed him. And there was a tree that had fallen in the rainforest. This is a trail we'd been on 10 or 15 times before. In the crook of the tree, he said, here's your plant. I looked at it. I instantly recognized it. That was Codonanthopsis dissimulata. I said, how did you find it? He said that the night before he had taken Kamarampi, and during the time he had a vision, a woman came to him and said, this is the plant you're looking for. He remembered the green color of the plant. Now, keep in mind, this is the Amazonian rainforest, the greenest place in the world.
I was about to say, green.
It was the shade. And that's how he recognized the plant. You know, it wasn't from my drawings or my description. But this is an example. I mean, another one would be, one of my mentors was Professor Schultes from Harvard, who was considered the father of modern ethnobotany. I had spent 6.5 hours with him in 1992. Professor Schultes had told me this story that he would see two trees. To him, as a botanist, were identical. Some of the indigenous people, they could tell that they were chemically distinct, and they proved this in the lab. So an innate sense of difference. So call it extrasensory perception, but this is a profound thing. I saw similar examples. So to us, or to Westerners, it would look like these are primitive people in rudimentary clothing, but they're geniuses of the rainforest. They've adapted. They have been decades in the same spot without depleting the game or the fish and eking out a living. And again, a place that would kill somebody who didn't know how to live there.
Do you think that the ritual or the approach that the indigenous population has to these plants should also be adopted by Westerners as we adopt these plants, fingers crossed?
I'm so glad you asked, because the answer is yes. I would not recommend ayahuasca to anybody except in a ritual context. And the reason is they're going to have a scary experience, vomiting, total loss of control without any context. Here, I was in a supportive environment. Keep in mind, I didn't speak much Igenga. What I got was translated. But, I saw, heard, experienced enough to understand what was going on and the profundity of this adaptation to life in a hostile environment. I'm not going to say that taking ayahuasca recreationally would trivialize it, but many people would. I just couldn't recommend that. If somebody, again, did it in an urban environment, I just don't know what they're going to learn from it, except how to scare themselves and get sick and wonder why they did it. They might have some deep insights, but it really, again, would depend on the milieu. And if they had someone helping to guide the experience that really knew what they were doing.
If you could legalize one drug right now, just with a flick of your hand, which one would it be?
Well, to be fair, it would have to be cannabis.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's a long list behind that.
What prospects do we have here in Washington State? I know that's not going to really super help everyone else who's listening from somewhere else, but selfishly, I want to know, what is the state of development here for legalizing things beyond cannabis?
Well, I think people are going to need to see what's happened in Oregon. If it went on the ballot, it would win, I'm pretty sure. There are enough people on this side of the Cascades that would vote for it. I mean, I'm reminded, it was probably 7 years ago. I was at a conference in Vancouver. It was a cannabis conference, but they had a session on psychedelics. The speaker asked the question, how many people here are microdosing? I thought there'd be a smattering. 2/3 of the hands went up. And this was 7 years ago. And now everybody's doing it. But man, I was shocked then. So there is an increasing recognition by the public that these are useful tools, again, to deal with everyday life. And the beauty of that is these are tiny doses. That's why it's called a microdose. And these do not cause any problems, but can provide a person real insight and function more effectively. Again, I think it's always best done with good direction, but the chances for misadventures are really pretty low.
So what are your big open questions now as you continue on your journey?
Can we really do this? Now, there are real hindrances, and it's not always legal barriers. This business is really difficult. There's no funding. A lot of companies have gone out of business. There are a lot of get-rich schemers out there. Not everybody is a reliable partner. So they're really daunting barriers to making progress. And yeah, I'd like to think I know better than the next guy how it should be done. But, we're still trying.
You can find Dr. Ethan Russo's work with Credo Science at credo-science.com. His articles and book chapters are under the library tab at ethanrusso.org.
In the meantime, get lost with us. Find us on Twitter at Amanda Knox.
At ManUnderBridge.
You can learn more about our work and how to support it at amandaknox.com. And if taking a dose of labyrinths cures your ills, please tell your friends, share on social media, and leave us a 5-star review.
Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. This episode was written and produced by us. Our managing producer is Andre Sapp, our production assistant is Charlie Darnell, and our theme music is by Josh Budo Karp.
In the Labyrinths podcast system, the listener is serenaded by two separate but equally important hosts, Amanda Knox, who brings authenticity and empathy, and Christopher Robinson, who brings intellectual curiosity. These are their stories.
What do you think, Knox?
Looks like a podcast junkie, shot up with one too many ads.
Should have become a patron from the looks of it.
Who wouldn't prefer ad-free episodes and signed books and live video hangouts over overdosing on ads in an alleyway?
Don't patronize me, Knox. Leave that to the listener.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson.